Okay. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. This is Ben Kaler, Science Coordinator for the Gulf Coast Prairie. Welcome, everyone, to the GCP LCC Lunchtime Webinar Series, May 2016 edition. As I said, my name is Ben Kaler, and I'll be your host today. I wanted to offer special thanks to Greg Elliott for arranging the technical and communication aspects of the webinar. Before we begin, I remind everyone listening in to please mute your phones during the presentation. There will be time, and we encourage you to ask questions after the presentation. Today, we're joined by Dr. Mark Johnston with the Keller Science Action Center at the Chicago Field Museum in the Windy City. In just a moment, Dr. Johnston will talk to us about landscape conservation design efforts for monarch butterflies in urban areas. Before he takes the floor, Bill Bardish, coordinator for the GCP, would like to offer some special remarks on efforts for monarch conservation across the landscape, and we'll also introduce our speaker. So take it away, Bill.
Thank you, Ben. Again, this is Bill Bardish, coordinator for the Gulf Coast Prairie Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and I appreciate everyone who has joined us, taking their time today to listen to Mark. I think you will be surprised and enlightened by what Mark has to share. I think I was somewhat of a skeptic when I first heard about the concept of landscape design and conservation planning for urban areas, but after I have found more out about the Chicago Wilderness Project, that particular expanding and very successful 6-county wilderness in the greater Chicago area, the more impressed I've been. And after hearing Abigail Derby Lewis, the team leader, and Mark give their presentation in Austin a few weeks ago, I thought this was timely to get Mark on our webinar series and begin to acquaint folks in the Gulf Coast Prairie landscape about what we hope to do in the southern part of the I-35 corridor. We've been lucky, fortunate, and glad to have the joint venture, the Migratory Bird Joint Ventures, actively involved in bird conservation and grassland restoration, especially the Oaks and Prairie Joint Venture in their Grassland Restoration Incentive Program. They've caught the eye of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation by bringing monarchs and grassland birds in those landscapes together in a very good relationship for the focus of conservation dollars in the future. And now looking at the urban areas, a major part of our landscape, how do we connect those areas with some of the work we're doing in the rural lands, the non-urban lands, what we call our ranch lands, farmlands, and grasslands throughout the southern plains. So again, I just wanted to get people thinking about those concepts, linking these landscapes between cities and ranch lands, between cities and farms, how we create a model for monarch conservation and grassland birds and other species in North America. I think there's some opportunities that we're just now starting to unveil and consider. So we're glad to have Mark Johnston again with us today. Mark has a doctorate in ecology and works as a geographic information manager for the Keller Science Action Center. He's a geospatial team leader who coordinates the work of team members at the Chicago Field Museum. He develops methodology, workflow, and assists in development of models, publishes and administers the online interactive maps and geospatial tools for the museum. Dr. Johnson brings expertise in ecology, ethnographic data collection, vegetation mapping using remote sensing technology, and great communication skills, I'd like to add, Mark. So without further ado, Dr. Johnston, we welcome you to the Gulf Coast Prairie. You now have control of the WebEx, and the floor is yours.
Excellent, Bill. Thank you so much for that introduction. That's nice of you. And thank you also for providing this opportunity to speak with everyone. So this is great. Yeah, so we've been underway on this project for a few months now, but we still feel like we're just getting our feet wet and really getting into it now that we've kind of met with all the different partners that we're working with in the 4 different cities, and we'll go through those geographies a little bit later. To begin, can everyone see my screen okay, I hope? There was a flash there for a minute where it turned off my monitor, I think, so I want to...
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, great. So this, probably everyone has seen this first slide here, but this shows the precipitous decline of monarch populations in Mexico as they're measured in acreage during their overwintering population, or during their overwintering time.
Just a second.
Yeah.
I can see all of your slides at once.
Oh, I've got the wrong
monitor.
Wrong monitor shared here. Let me fix that. Let me stop and restart sharing here. All right, so let's see. You see a lovely waterfall here?
Sure.
Just a minute. All right.
That's good.
Thank you. Great. So I think probably a lot of folks are familiar with this slide showing how the population has declined, but there is obviously a lot of fluctuation as well, as you can see by those ups and downs. I'll just go on from there to say that, you know, how important is it, how important are cities in this process is not entirely clear. We've focused a lot on agricultural lands and kind of the corn belt throughout the Midwest. But we're asking with this project, how much of a bump can we put in the needle of the population by looking at cities and trying to really increase habitat. And by habitat, we're talking about, of course, milkweed is important, but also nectaring plants. And some of the work that we'll be doing, really more focused up in with the folks up in the Twin Cities, they'll be looking at more of the biological aspects. Here in Chicago, we'll be more focused on looking at acreage and how much green space we think we can convert over. So we'll get into that in a minute. Anticipated, so this is an overview of the presentation. We're going to look at do cities matter first off, and then we'll talk about some of the different planning tools and products that we're hoping to produce with this, and then talk a little bit about those 4 geographies and how what we're doing a little bit differently in those 4 different areas. So another slide you're probably all familiar with. So this is really looking at what the priorities are across the U.S. and or certainly in the Midwest along that I-35 corridor. And this prioritization process has been, I think, super helpful. But obviously the focus of this is really from that county-wide scale and up. So we're looking on this project to see, you know, just how important are cities at that sort of micro scale. And so if we look at that I-35 corridor, we can see this. So this slide's showing these different metropolitan areas for cities that are specifically over 50,000 in population. And with all these cities that have 50,000 or more population, they have a metropolitan planning agency, so they all have things like land use and some basic data sets that we can work with to do some spatial modeling. We're not focused in this project on all of these cities. That would be a pretty huge undertaking, but we're looking at these 4 cities, example cities, as a way to kind of look at how we can do this elsewhere and to see what effect we think cities can and are having on the population. So let me just list those cities since I keep mentioning them. So we're working here in Chicago and also in Austin, and then the Twin Cities and Kansas City. So those are the 4, and we'll talk more about those. So one of the key data sets that that's feeding the national data set is this cropland data layer. Another one is the NLCD, or the National Land Cover Data Set. And obviously this is no big surprise, but excuse me, but in the city there isn't a whole lot of of agriculture right in the city, but there's actually quite a bit that's right up next to it. So we're seeing this as, you know, are there ways that we can tie together what we're doing at the sort of micro scale within the city to what's happening at the countywide scale, at the national scale? And I think that we will find a pretty good mesh there. We may actually borrow some of the numbers from the national data set in order to look at those agricultural lands to really sort of finger the two models in together. But, oh, sorry, let me back up. Can I back up? There we go. So I'm going to look, I wish I could, can I point with my mouse? Yeah. So this is Cook County here, kind of the grayest area that you can see in the center. I'm going to focus in on that area because it looks like there's absolutely no opportunity in there from you know, looking at the CDL layer. But, and then this is what the national land cover data set looks like. Also looks pretty bleak. What you see in red is developed land. But if you use a different data set to look at this, this is using land cover at a really high resolution where U.S. Forest Service has mapped out all the trees, and in the same process they've mapped out all the grass and shrub layers. This data set goes down to about 2-foot resolution, so it's super sharp. And what we found is with this, we can really start to get a measure on just how much green space is there and what sort of opportunities do we have from that. To work in. And so if you look at that area that I've got highlighted there in white, we're going to zoom in on that part of the model or that part of the data set to see what it looks like. So this is showing grass shrub just within that, again, like an area that's super built up. So this is showing kind of the extreme, and yet there's quite a bit of green space in there. Obviously not all of this would be converted over to habitat for monarchs, but a proportion of it would be, or potentially. We have that data set that I showed and this one to work with for our model building process. And so this is land use, and it's at a pretty high resolution in Chicago. We actually started with 60 land cover classes, and we've kind of merged those together to come up with these 15 that you see here. But we think that by merging these together, we can simplify the model and really start to see what opportunities exist by each different land use category. And so this is one of the fun things we've done is combine those two together. And so if you look at just that grass shrub, the area that we think is sort of has the highest potential for planting milkweed, you can categorize it by different types of land use. So what you're seeing on your screen here, everything that has a color of any color is representing grass and shrub, and then the color that is indicated there tells you which land use category it falls within. And so some of the things we can do with this is we can start to quantify, you know, how much grass shrub we have within each different land use category. Then we can start to ask really more questions about how much of that space do we think can be converted to habitat. So by looking at different scales, this is really just sort of an example here. The analysis will be done kind of wall to wall across the whole area, so it won't really be broken up. But we're going to have a biological team, a social team, and geospatial team, and that will have biological and social in all 4 cities. And what we'll be able to do is start to look at these different scales and start to do surveys, lots of qualitative interviews with practitioners, with different contacts that we're able to establish in all these different categories, and start to get an idea of what are some of the best engagement strategies that we're seeing for interacting with the public and with landowners to get them to be interested in doing some work on their own property. And so some of the, let's see, so some of the questions that we're asking here are, what contribution can urban areas make to monarch conservation in general? Where do we focus the conservation to achieve the best ecological and social results? How do we best engage various urban sectors and residents in this project? So again, through doing things like this is an online questionnaire that we're putting together. Actually, it's ready to go, I think, at this point. We'll be able to contact lots of folks and locally and get their feedback on, you know, why they've decided to convert their land in situations where they have, or what roadblocks might exist for doing some of that work if those do exist. So that's kind of going to be some of the work of the social team to get enough information that will eventually feed into a geospatial model that we're putting together, and we'll also go into developing a framework. So this is giving you an idea of some of the products that we're talking about. So that we'll have some planning tools, interactive planning tools. These will be things that will allow us to do some scenario modeling. So you'll be able to have targets that will estimate what targets might be possible within different land use categories. So you might think like residential. Like if we focus on a certain geography within any given metropolitan area, and let's say we focused on the vacant lots within those residential areas, how much of an effect could we have by concentrating our efforts in those areas? And so we'll be able to come up with targets and then allow users to bump those numbers up or down and see what effect that would have on increasing populations, or really on increasing habitat, and then our estimate on what that effect that might have on the population. So estimate the amount of existing monarch habitat across the metro areas, estimate the realistic potential for creating more habitat based on social and physical limitations. And then also we'll be developing a LCD framework that really will be, the idea here is to kind of create almost a how-to to allow other metropolitan areas to do the same kind of work that we've done, and to leverage some of the work we've done to do similar things in their areas, and also to really benefit from what we find from our from those engagement strategies and finding out what works best. And that methodology obviously will go with that. So here's some of the goals of that geospatial modeling. It's kind of related to the same. We need to first establish a baseline estimate of the existing milkweed stems. This is going to be pretty challenging, but we want to first kind of start off by mapping out all the grassland, prairies, and kind of naturalized areas within the cities. We'll do that based on land cover and land use information, and working with the local cities to do those estimates. And then we'll actually send out biological teams to go into the field and actually get an estimate on some of those, to do some sampling work to find out how accurate that is. And then that's sort of a direct measure in a way, or somewhat direct measure of how much habitat we see in those areas. And then there'll be kind of a background one as well that will be done kind of on a land use by land use category, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. We'll assess the habitat contribution potential in urban areas, guide conservation efforts for monarch appropriate to the urban landscape, assess the importance of patch size and connectivity and monarch productivity. This last one will really be a focus in the Twin Cities for the most part, but we do want to try to do it in all of our different areas, geographies. And I'll get into that a little bit too. That'll be with Karen Oberhauser's work up in the Twin Cities. So some of the important terms in order to kind of understand where we're going with this model is what we refer to as the conversion rate and the adoption rate. The conversion rate you can think of as if you go to places where, let's say, a corporate campus or a HOA, a homeowners association, or different places where they've actually converted some of their green space over to naturalized areas, we want to go to those spaces and see how much of their green space they have converted or that they're maintaining. So that's what we're calling, the amount of habitat that's been converted to the ratio of how much green space there is what we're referring to with that. And then the adoption rate is really looking at, okay, of all the HOAs that are out there, whichever land use category you want to look at, of all those folks that are out there, how many of them are actually doing anything on their land in regards to this conversion? And so we call that the adoption rate. So one is how much they convert, the second is how many people are making that conversion. And then kind of on an anecdotal level, we'll be receiving a lot of data through surveys and qualitative interviews to try to give us an idea of what sort of targets we might be able to set. And then we'll use those to feed our model to estimate, where we might be able to go with realistic sort of numbers to estimate how much habitat could be created in different land use categories. And then, well, as I already mentioned, baseline milkweed estimate will be actually going out and trying to measure how much is present. So this is very much of a concept here, but this might be something that the interface would look like for one of the geospatial tools. And this would be basically, so what you're looking at here is a really zoomed in area right around the Field Museum, actually, looking at census tracts. And the idea is you could select a small geography here and then see what is the potential within each one of these census tracts for creating more habitat. We'd first have a baseline estimate, and then we'd also have a target. And so the little gauges kind of down at the bottom are to kind of give you an idea, well, how many stems would be there currently and how many stems would we be able to bump it up to. And this is very much just conceptual right now, but these numbers are somewhat made up, I think. Some of them are real in terms of the actual area, but this is one of the ideas we're looking at for creating an interface that would allow planners and decision makers to help assess what can be done in different parts of the city. And so the idea is here you could also target certain land use categories, like I mentioned before, with vacant lots and so forth. And then we can have a lot of other data layers that you see on the left there that you could look at independently. Okay, so looking at some of those different geographies, so these are the four that I mentioned. Chicago, a lot of our focus in the Chicago region is going to be on figuring out what is the baseline, how much do we currently have for habitat, and what do we think the potential is based on all of our social work interacting with the public. In the Twin Cities, the focus is going to be much more on the biological components of looking at productivity. So we're talking about actually counting eggs on milkweed stems, assessing them at least 3 times a year. We're going to be looking at patch size. So we'll look at is there an effect on how large the size of that habitat is. And so there'll be small patches, large patches. We'll kind of look at a couple of different categories there, and then even micro patches. So I think size-wise, we're thinking about relatively small. We're talking about, I think, about 4 acres roughly and up for the large patches. I think the small ones were going to be around 1 to 2, and then micro is like looking at people's backyards and small planter areas, because those areas obviously add up to be quite a bit across the whole city. So that's the focus in the Twin Cities. In the Austin area, based on our communication with folks there and interactions with folks who've heard that the type of milkweed that you're able to grow is super important. Basically in Chicago, we can grow common milkweed everywhere. So it's really not a huge issue of what to plant where. In Austin, that is a big issue, and I'll show a couple slides about that as well. Kansas City, based on our last meeting there, they really want to focus on their partnerships. So they're going to host several workshops and really try to pull together and capitalize on the work that's already being done and try to get folks working together more. So then going back, so we were talking about that baseline. So this is first kind of doing our best to map out where milkweed and where habitats are currently, and then we'd be going and sampling these areas to see what the density is and trying to get estimates across the region. This is really just looking at those really high quality areas, but we will certainly add more to that. And then in order to get baseline, in addition to going to known populations, we need to get an idea of the background amount of milkweed just present within other land use categories. So we're talking about, this is kind of an older slide, but we're talking about setting up transects that would go across the city, and we'll sample from different land use categories. So there'll be a sampling point somewhere along a line that's extending across the city, and then from there we'll see, we'll look for all the 15 different land use categories within a given radius, and then sample the block surrounding those. Or we haven't decided on the full radius, but we'll be sampling within each one of those land use categories that occurs near the sampling sites. So that'll be part of the effort that the biological team is doing. And to do this, we'll use interactive maps. So this is just showing one that's through a web browser, but it also can pull up data using like the Survey 123 type of an application, where you can add a query or add a survey of different questions referring to the site. So this is one that we based off of Karen Oberhauser's. She's got a guide on like how to assess habitat, and it's called the Monarch Breeding Habitat Assessment Tool, and so we'll be using that for some of our work. Again, in the Twin Cities, they're really looking at whether cities are a source or a sink for monarch populations. And so looking at, this is actually kind of cheating. This is in Chicago. This is State Street, and it's tropical milkweed. But as anecdotally speaking, the populations along the street were just going crazy along here. And so we were seeing that there could be a lot of productivity in really small spaces. Karen's going to actually study that by looking at the patch size and connectivity and attractiveness as or other variables that they're going to look at. And so attractiveness, they're talking about looking at the local conditions. So you're looking at, is there a park nearby, are there trees, are there a road nearby, or is it noisy, is it windy? Kind of looking at all those micro scale factors that may have an effect. So the connectivity piece of it, we're looking at mapping out, again, those core prairie areas. And again, I'm using Chicago as an example here, but we'll be doing this in the Twin Cities. So if those are the core areas, and then this is, you can create essentially what's called an impedance raster to see which areas are easy and difficult for monarchs to travel across. And using that information, you can come up with these connectivity assessments and actually get some values between the different patches and the areas where they occur to come up with an estimate of how well these areas are connected to each other. And then we can see, basically we're looking at coming up with a couple of different stratified groups where we have really well connected and really not well connected, and just seeing if we're seeing an effect there. Again, so the biology within cities is really, on monarchs, is really not well known. So these are kind of unique studies. Karen's really seen as one of the foremost experts, so I think it's really great that they're focused on this kind of work to add to the project. Excuse me. In Austin, we're going to do something pretty different there, as I mentioned, because of one of the real roadblocks there is potentially which species grows where. This is on a statewide scale, so I did a quick niche modeling assessment looking at data that we got from GBIF, the Global Biological Information Facility, I think. So GBIF was the data source. I think actually the data fed into that was from iTree, if folks are familiar with that. But we took those species and put them into a model to figure out, based on climatic variables, where those species can occur. And so that's sort of the color of the dot indicates the species, and the color of the region also is paired with that species and where it is most likely to occur. It doesn't mean that it can't grow outside of that area, because we've got it pretty locked down to just those core areas in this particular slide. The idea here is this is at a state scale. We want to do this within the Austin region at a micro scale. You can see all these species are really coming together right in the center of Austin, so it's a really kind of exciting place to work in, really. So that's the focus area. And we think that, in order to do that, so that last model I showed is based on climatic variables, which as you zoom in at that scale, they're going to get pretty granular. We think that by focusing on soil types and slope and a variety of other factors, we can hopefully narrow down within this much smaller geography what grows best where. And so that's with Barbara Wiley. She's helping us out down there to really, she knows the area so well, she can help us by telling us what populations she's actually been involved with in different areas, plant populations, and tell us, local site conditions that we can help to feed into a different kind of a model that tell us, what plant can grow where. So that could be pretty exciting work as well. So that's all I have. That's I guess the other thing to say is we have a workshop, again, that's kind of at the end of the year. I think we're talking about September for that workshop. That would be in Kansas City, I believe. Abigail Derby-Lewis is really the point person on this project, so she'd be a good one to get in touch with about some of those details. But thank you guys so much for your time on this.
Wow, thank you, Mark. Before I open it up for other questions, I'm wondering, this is a kind of really high scale, like fine scale geospatial modeling tools for Monarch, and I know that there are some other efforts. Primarily, the one that comes to mind is out of the USGS La Crosse office, and they're doing more of the coarser scale things that look at species distribution models for monarchs and other butterflies under different climate change scenarios. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because, from our neck of the woods, we're sort of where the first generation of breeders come in, and under different scenarios of climate change, we're looking at, assuming those models are valid, that it'll be pretty unsuitable climate-wise for the first couple generations of breeders into the future under different scenario techniques. And so I'm wondering to what extent your efforts complement and how have you found communicating with that Monarch team up in La Crosse?
Yeah, we have not really been in direct communication, so that I think that it would make sense to reach out a bit more with those folks and to see how our models can integrate. Our focus really has been more on, I mean, obviously with any of this kind of work, it's about trying to simplify down the models and make sense of what you can, depending on your focus. So, yeah, we haven't gotten too much into climate change, although certainly where plants are able to grow, things like, what I was just talking about in Austin could be deeply affected by these things. Yeah, all that work is really important. I think as you go more and more micro on the scale, it's tougher and tougher to look at those larger scale issues that obviously are affecting everything. So,
yeah, and also, in one of your early slides, you looked at the different types of opportunities, or the stakeholders who might have opportunities, and you banded those into different size categories. And during your talk, I was actually looking at an aerial photo of part of Chicago, and it seems like there are some large, green corridors, as you know, through the city, as well as other cities as well. that have these really large blocks of either public land or private land, namely cemeteries, golf courses, things like that. And I'm wondering what the different engagement strategies or engagement efforts have been for those sort of like small owner groups, but really, really large land capabilities.
Right, right. That's a good question. I mean, we're still really just getting underway with this project, but we are trying our best to identify all those really important groups. Certainly there's one that comes to mind. There's a kind of a group that's gotten themselves organized on right-of-way as habitat, and so that involves a lot of the utility companies who have a lot of land, and as you say, I mean, they're not a lot of owners necessarily. It's more land, and potentially has more. You can get more bang for your buck if you can just get one person on board. And yeah, with those HOAs, there's things that we've done with interacting with, like there's church groups and things that are really well organized. Faith in Place, I think, is one that comes to mind, where if we can get you know, some folks involved, we can really have a strong effect potentially. So yeah, that'll be. We have a new social coordinator who's, I think, just starting up next month, and I think that'll be a strong focus for her. But yeah, I'm more focused on the geospatial part of it.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Sure.
Just as an aside for the engagement stuff, and I was looking at different things the other day, but apparently the National Catholic Education Association actually have a Monarch Garden grant program for schools. That's nationwide, so I wasn't sure if you all knew about that. Just want to throw that out.
No, yeah, that's great to know.
So if anyone else has any questions for Mark, the floor is yours.
Any other questions?
Mark, this is Greg. I don't know whether I sort of asked this question before, and you said it was somebody else that might be able to answer, but I think she might be attending this webinar. But I'm just curious to know more about the sort of the outreach aspects and the surveys and how you're planning on using all that information, sort of like once the initial study and LCD framework is set up, to continue this process of getting people involved. I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah, sure. Abigail, are you on the line? Yeah, I don't think she's here.
I thought she was.
Yeah. Yeah, there certainly will be a lot of outreach. I think we're even hoping to get a second round of funding that would really start to look at the smaller scale of cities. So this, looking at, in that earlier slide, I have a 50,000 and above, kind of at that smaller scale. I think then you're continually, getting in contact with more and more smaller populations and getting those populations together in these different workshops that we're going to be putting on to really kind of get that critical mass, hopefully. Certainly the work itself, we're going to be out there physically on the ground, interacting with folks and spreading out our survey. We've had this is sort of small scale, but we had a members night here at the museum and engaged with lots of folks that come through. Can't remember if it's like 10,000 or more folks that come through, and just engaging as much as we can with those folks and having them, a lot of them filled out just a very short survey to give us information about their gardening practices. So there's certainly an awareness. I mean, anecdotally from speaking with folks, most people knew there's a problem with the monarch population, and we need to do what we can to rebound it a little bit. So they were interested in what they could do to help out. So
and also, so when you develop this landscape conservation design framework, do you anticipate that the types of organizations that might be interested in, extending it and taking that on in a new cities would be sort of like the corollary to the Chicago Field Museum? Like, are those the kind of groups that you're going to, or are you thinking municipal governments? Or I'm just curious.
You mean in terms of which cities would pick it up and try to do?
Yeah, or who within the city.
Yeah.
Like I live in Memphis. I can't imagine the government in Memphis doing that.
Right.
You know, like that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah. Well, I think just picking up the framework itself, you don't necessarily have to, hire up a team of geospatial folks like us to do the work. I think you could glean a lot of information from what we're going to get out of the social survey information and see like, engaging schools in this way, or working with your landscape contractors and your seed banks and your your museums, and I think there's a lot of those different engagement strategies. People are doing the work already, and cities where they haven't started doing that work, I think they could learn a lot from places where they are. So my hope is that framework itself will kind of be, can stand on its own in terms of being super beneficial to the project.
Thanks.
Yeah, and then like I say, within with this other project we're talking about doing with a smaller scale, that would involve also geospatial models, but much simpler ones that I think can be done anywhere. And that might be even an easier engagement strategy or an easier tool that could be developed in those cities, to do some of the similar work. So. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm not shy to point people out, but I noticed that we've got Julie McIntyre and Glenn White and Kristen Shaw on the line, and if they would like to add any sort of maybe words of wisdom or any sort of perspective for this discussion, I welcome any of your input.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Julie in Region 2 in Albuquerque. And, I was curious about earlier drafts of this project had included elements of encouraging sustainability and incorporating, for example, especially in the Southwest, things like water conservation or additional uses of green space, et cetera. And I was wondering if that was still part of, say, the sociological dimension.
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly earlier on we were talking about looking at ecosystem services and what additional benefit, what are the co-benefits we could be looking at. And those are definitely not out the window in terms of things we'd like to work on. I think just right now as the field season's approaching, we're just really focused on like what do we need to do to get boots on the ground and collecting the information that we need. So that's our bigger focus right now, but certainly I think as we get closer to producing a tool that the public will interact with, we'll want to look more and more at those things.
This is Gwen, and I think the fall workshop that Mark referenced will be an opportunity to bring individuals together from many different urban areas, both those that have been involved with the project as well as those who are interested in using these tools. And that'll give us a chance to really find out from them, is it the Metropolitan Planning Organization that would use the tool or a local conservation alliance, and then also some of those social aspects will come out of the surveys that are being done this summer, and then a synthesis of that can be presented to the people who come to the workshop, and we can really kind of feel them out as far as what those co-benefits might be that they would be interested in doing, that we could do further research on.
That sounds great. And I had noticed that co-benefits on the left on one of one of the slides that you had up that you said was sort of made up, but one of the boxes was co-benefits, and I was wondering, what those were. And thanks, Gwen, for that explanation.
Yeah, let me see if I can find that slide. Yeah, I think you're referring to this one.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
I really enjoyed that slide.
well, it's conceptual, of course, but
right.
But yeah, I think this is where we can start to dream a little bit on what we want this tool to do and what we'll get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, yeah, there could be a reporting mechanism that would come out of it to give us an idea of, you know, what some of those benefits are as you look at different habitats. So, you know, like I guess a tool that comes to mind for me, there's something called iTree that you might be familiar with, where it looks at, for trees, it looks at like what are the stormwater benefits and how much carbon sequestration is happening for different species. So if you have the data to feed the model, then you can start to ask these questions and get some estimates out of it. Obviously, we won't be able to go into tons of depth in terms of doing the research, but if there's other research that's been done that we can, you know, get some of those numbers as estimates, then I think that would be where we could plug things in to come up with some of those co-benefits.
Great. No, this is, I've been a little out of the loop, so this is a great refresher, and it's wonderful where you're going with it all.
Oh, thank you. Are there questions?
All right, hearing none, I would just like to thank you, Mark, for coming on and taking the bait and presenting to us. And I wish you all the best in seeing this project through, and we all look forward to hearing updates and getting this, continuing the discussion for landscape conservation for monarchs all the way across the breeding range. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's obviously a great opportunity for us and to help spread word about the project that we're working on. So yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, have a great month.